Imagine that you're in a little Swiss hamlet in the Alps, and you wake up to this. Quote, "Several days had passed in winter quarters, and Galba had given orders for grain to be brought in from the neighborhood, when all of a sudden his scouts informed him that in the night every soul had withdrawn from that part of the town which he had granted to the Gauls, and that the heights overhanging were occupied by an enormous host of Seduni and Veragri." End quote. More trouble for Caesar by land and sea in this Book 3 of the Gallic War Commentaries. I'm Alex Petkus, and you are listening to The Cost of Glory, where it is our mission to retell the lives, deeds, and characters of the greatest Greek and Roman heroes. This is part 3 of 8 of our series on one of Rome's greatest wars, Caesar's conquest of Gaul. In this episode, we are returning once again to a book that made nations, a book read and admired by countless leaders, Machiavelli, Washington, Hamilton, commented on by Napoleon, who we'll hear from later, men who used this book to forge their own paths to greatness. And in chapter 3, or let's call it book 3, of On the Gallic War, Caesar challenges the great seafaring nation of the Veneti on the Atlantic, among other campaigns. If you like diving into the kind of technology that wins wars, this is a great episode for you. And also there's some great insights into how to manage your subordinates and bring out the best in them. But Caesar also hints, very briefly, at some developments on the home front. And I want to give you a little idea of what's going on in Rome at this time. But let's get into it. We'll get back to the show in just a moment, but I want to share a story with you. One time, when Julius Caesar was pacifying Gaul, the Gauls rose up in rebellion, and Caesar had to send some urgent, sensitive, strategic instructions to one of his lieutenants. So he chose to add an extra measure of security, and he wrote a letter to the man in Greek, which he knew the Gauls did not understand. Caesar was fluent in Greek, like most of the other Roman upperclassmen of his time, like Sulla, Cicero, Pompey, Cato. In fact, the Romans considered learning a different classical language as a key to perfecting their powers of persuasion in their own native tongue of Latin. Have you ever thought about doing this to refine your own writing and speaking skills? Well, seeing as how the Herculaneum papyri are now being actively deciphered, most are in Greek, but some are in Latin too, well, maybe it's time to get started so you can read some of them in the original someday. If you or someone you know wants to learn Greek or Latin, I highly recommend checking out this episode's sponsor, Ancient Language Institute. Ancient Language Institute, ALI for short, offers highly engaging online courses in Greek and Latin, also Biblical Hebrew and Old English if that's your thing. They have courses at all levels, both for adults and also special classes for kids from elementary through high school, and they have group classes and also one-on-one tutoring. I love their teaching philosophy. They use the direct method, which gets you speaking, hearing, and reading the original languages from day one, and you'll learn grammar too, of course. But I've personally benefited immensely from adopting these active style methods into my own self-sharpening habits. There really is nothing like reading the actual words of Caesar or Cicero or Plato or Homer in the original. And ALI wants to help you look not just at the ancient texts and authors, but with them, which is a real paradigm shift, let me tell you. So check out Ancient Language Institute at ancientlanguage.com, and thanks, ALI, for being fans of The Cost of Glory. Now first, and this is actually related to the homefront question, Caesar opens this book with his legate, this man Galba that we just mentioned, coming very close to disaster in the winter in the Alps. It's interesting because this activity actually happens late in the year 57, so it technically should have belonged in the previous book, which was book 2, where he talks about the campaign of 57, because Caesar organizes his books by campaign season years. But I guess he wanted to end the last book with the news of this unprecedented 15-day Thanksgiving celebration for his victories so far, to end on a high note. Remember, this is also wartime propaganda. So let's start by taking a look at what happens to Galba in the opening of Book 3. The man, by the way, is Servius Galba, who later runs for the consulship for the year 49, and he fails. Caesar pulled all of these strings to try to get him elected, but it didn't work out. It was a tough time for Caesar in Roman politics that year. So even though Galba was a loyal supporter of Caesar, and Caesar loyally supported him, as we mentioned, Galba ends up joining the conspiracy of Brutus and Cassius, and he becomes one of the men who stabs Caesar in the Senate in 44 BC. But that's all later. Right now, Caesar's going to do him a favor, and he's going to give the man the spotlight and show how he deals with a very difficult situation in this Gallic War commentary. Now, Galba is, as we said, in the Alps, and he's got his forces, he's got one legion, the 12th Legion, in a mountain pass. It's in the territory of the Allobroges, and you could say, if you're a Roman, that this is technically in the Roman province. This is the borderlands between Transalpine and Cisalpine Gaul. But if you said that, the people of the mountains might have a different opinion of this question of whose territory it really is. Mountain dwellers are very hard to tame. And to be a little bit more specific of where Galba is, he's right now near some of the highest mountains in Europe. He's at Octodunum, which is now called Martigny. It's at the foot of Mont Blanc and Monte Rosa, also the Matterhorn. I am informed by Google Maps that there are some very nice ski areas around there now. And the reason that Galba is there is to secure the Great St. Bernard Pass, which is necessary to make transit between Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul easier for, diplomatic missions, merchants, and of course the occasional army led by a commander bent on becoming the first man in Rome. So Galba has gotten comfortable there at his camp because he's captured a few native forts and he's also exchanged hostages with the local elites. And this is usually a guarantee of good behavior. They've got sons of noble men from the Gauls there in their camp with him. So it's understandable that he lets his guard down. But on this one particular morning, the camp wakes up to find that their native friends that they just concluded a peace with have vanished, and that there's a huge force of armed Gauls lining the very steep slopes that are around the camp. And Caesar explains their reasoning here. Quoting Caesar here, "Several causes had contributed to make the Gauls suddenly adopt the plan of renewing the war and crushing the legion. In the first place, they despised the small numbers of a single legion, from which 2 cohorts had been withdrawn and a considerable number of private soldiers sent off to seek supplies." Galba, again, he kind of let his guard down. In the second place, they supposed that because of the disadvantage of position, since they themselves would charge down from the heights into the valley and hurl their missiles, not even their first onset, so they thought, could be withstood. Moreover, they were indignant that their children had been taken away from them under the title of hostages, and they were convinced that the Romans were endeavoring to seize the peaks of the Alps and to add those districts to their neighboring province, not only for the sake of the roots, but to secure a permanent occupation. End quote. And I love how Caesar is so frank and honest about the natives' perspective really throughout this work. He'll say, they believe the Romans are trying to conquer them. And that's basically what's happening, isn't it? So for all that this is a sort of propaganda work, Caesar maintains this very clear perspective, untainted by sentimentality for the most part throughout the book. Well, so here's what Galba does. Quote, "Galba therefore summoned with speed a council of war and proceeded to ask for expressions of opinion. The danger that had arisen was as serious as it was sudden and unexpected, and indeed by this time almost all higher ground was to be seen packed with a host of armed men, while with the communications interrupted, reinforcements could not be attempted nor supplies brought up. In the council, therefore, the chance of safety was almost despaired of, and not a few opinions were expressed in favor of abandoning the baggage, making a sortie, and striving to win safety by the same routes which had brought them thither. Nonetheless, the majority decided to reserve this expedient to the final emergency, and meanwhile to await the issue and defend the camp." End quote. So they're not going to try to run away. They're going to withstand this attack that is clearly imminent. And they don't have to wait long. The Gauls charge down the hill. They throw their stones and javelins at the men on the Roman ramparts from high above. And Galba's got the camp only partially fortified at this point. He's, again, kind of off guard here. And the fighting is hard, and the Romans are so short on defenders that even the wounded can't afford to take a break from the fighting. They just have to keep at it. And here's what happens next. And see if you can remember here the man that Caesar names first. Quote, "The fighting actually went on for more than 6 hours on end, and not only the strength but the missiles of the Romans were failing. The enemy were pressing on more fiercely and beginning as our energy slackened to break down the rampart and fill the trench. At this juncture, Publius Sextius Baculus, the senior centurion, whom we have mentioned before as disabled by several wounds in the battle with the Nervii," that was in Book 2, "and with him Gaius Volusenus, a military tribune, a man of great sagacity and courage, hastened to Galba and informed him that the only hope of safety was to try the last expedient in making a sortie. Galba accordingly summoned the centurions and speedily instructed the troops to make a short pause in the fighting and merely to intercept the missiles discharged against them and to refresh themselves after their effort. Then, upon a given signal, to burst from the camp and place all hope of safety in courage." End quote. And that is exactly what they do. They burst out of the camp gate, they sweep around, and they cut off the attackers. And this surprise change of energy in the battle overwhelms and terrifies the Gauls. And they themselves, the Gauls, end up fleeing. And Caesar says that the Romans, which would have been less than 4,000 men, ended up slaughtering some 10,000 of the 30,000 who had attacked the fort. And, of course, they were following the advice of this fine soldier, Publius Sextius Baculus, who fought bravely against the Nervii despite receiving many wounds. He's still in action there. Once again, you've got to admire Caesar giving credit to his talent. And the next day, the Romans retreat to safer country down in the valley, in the plains, to finish the winter out. Well, now Caesar comments, as he has before and will again several times, that, at last, all Gaul is pacified. And he busies himself with some provincial matters in Illyria. But this peace, of course, does not last very long. Here's Caesar explaining what happens next. Quote, "But at this point, war broke out suddenly in Gaul, of which the cause was as follows. The young Publius Crassus with the 7th Legion had been wintering by the ocean in the country of the Andes. As there was a lack of grain in those parts, he dispatched several commandants and tribunes into the neighboring states to seek it. Of these officers, the names here are not important. Titus Tarasidius was sent among the Esubii, Marcus Trebius Gallus among the Curios Elites, Quintus Villanius with Titus Silius among the Veneti. These Veneti," still reading here, but these guys are important, the Veneti, "they exercise by far the most extensive authority over all the seacoast in those districts, for they have numerous ships in which it is their custom to sail to Britain." There's a breadcrumb there. "And they excel the rest in the theory and practice of navigation. As the sea is very boisterous and open, with but a few harbors here and there, which they hold themselves, they have as tributaries almost all those whose custom it is to sail that sea. It was the Veneti who took the first step by detaining Silius and Villanius, supposing that through them they should recover their own hostages, whom they had given to Crassus. They want to make a trade and get their guys back. Their authority induced their neighbors, for the Gauls are sudden and spasmodic in their designs, to detain Trebius and Tarasidius for the same reason, and rapidly dispatching deputies among their chiefs, they bound themselves by mutual oath to do nothing save by common consent, it's a conspiracy, and to abide together the single issue of their destiny. Moreover, they urged the remaining states to choose rather to abide in the liberty received from their ancestors than to endure Roman slavery. The whole seacoast was rapidly won over to their opinion, and they dispatched a deputation in common to Publius Crassus, bidding him restore their hostages if he wanted to receive back his own officers." End quote. So the area that Crassus is in is basically the northern sections of the Atlantic coast on the western seaboard of France. That's the southern reaches of this area that's now known as Brittany. And the key nation here is the Veneti, who Napoleon calls the people of Vannes, which is a major city in the area now in France, which, of course, takes its name from these exact Veneti. And it's interesting here, this taking of hostages strategy really doesn't seem to work all that well on the Gauls. The hostages would most likely be the sons of the nobles. So here, as perhaps in the former case in the Alps, either the Gauls trust the Romans not to murder their hostages. Of course, the Veneti here have got their own hostages, which is, some leverage. Or maybe they consider even their own not yet of age sons to be sort of legitimate combatants in this epical conflict for liberty. I think either way, it's really interesting that they're willing to put their own children at great risk here. It speaks to the fierce spirit of these people. So Caesar comments here that he gets the message from young Crassus about this hostage crisis, and he immediately sends orders to Crassus to get to work building ships. And just in passing, he notes, Caesar had to be away rather longer, ... And that little phrase covers a multitude of sins. It's worth remembering now the incredible storm of Roman politics that Caesar is navigating remotely, and which I think makes his achievements in Gaul all the more astonishing. The year's 56 right now, and Caesar had to do some major politicking that we'll cover more in his biography. We already sort of discussed it in the life of Crassus and Pompey. So basically, Caesar's 5-year command in Gaul is scheduled to end in 54. So you might think he's still got some time before he has to worry about politics. It's 56. But the Senate is legally bound to assign proconsular commands to the consuls before the consuls for the upcoming year are elected. So in other words, the proconsular, that is the provincial governor assignments, Caesar's a proconsul right now, sort of command extended from his consulship. That's the concept. So the proconsular commands for the year 54 get taken up by the consuls of the year 55, but those assignments have to be picked in the year 56. So what's detaining Caesar from bringing the war personally to the Veneti right now, he's detained, he says, is he's organizing this semi-secret, kind of open secret meeting at Lucca, which is a town in northern Italy. It's just inside his province of Cisalpine Gaul, though. And at that conference in Lucca, he corrals all of his supporters and many men who are on the fence, who maybe are thinking about becoming his supporters. They come to him, very notably, like hundreds of guys. And the other two triumvirs are there, Pompey and Crassus, of course. And together, behind closed doors, with all of the senators kind of milling around outside waiting for news, the triumvirs make a plan to dominate Roman politics for the following year. And this includes a plan to make sure that Caesar gets his command extended for another 5 years, which is important because many of Caesar's bitter enemies, powerful enemies in the Senate, are trying to dislodge him from leading the war in Gaul right now. And also, the triumvirs end up, after this, really twisting the orator Cicero's arm, and they get him to support their plan. Cicero, you might remember from earlier biographies, was up to this point a staunch opponent of Caesar. He wasn't a mortal enemy, though. And they get Cicero to kind of change his tune about the triumvirs, and he makes this famous speech on the consular provinces in the spring of 66. It's a great speech, and it's a lesson in what a political reconciliation of enemies looks like. And I'm just going to give you a brief quote from that speech to give you a sense of sort of what's going on in the background at Rome while this Gallic war is happening. Here's Cicero, quote, "The war with Gaul, O conscript fathers," he's addressing the Senate there, "has been carried on actively since Gaius Caesar has been our commander-in-chief. Previously, we were content to act in defense and to repel attacks," from the Gauls he means, "for our generals at all times thought it better to limit themselves in repulsing those nations, than to provoke their hostility by any attack of our own. Even that great man, Gaius Marius, whose godlike and amazing valor came to the assistance of the Roman people in many of its misfortunes and disasters, was content to drive back the enormous multitudes of Gauls who were forcing their way into Italy without endeavoring to penetrate into their cities and dwelling places. And he's going to contrast the great Marius with Caesar. So listen to this. But I see that the intentions of Gaius Caesar are very different. For he thought it his duty not only to wage war against those men whom he saw already in arms against the Roman people, but to reduce the whole nation of Gaul under our dominion. Therefore he fought with the greatest success against those most valiant and powerful nations, the Germans and the Helvetii. And the other nations he terrified and drove back and defeated, and he taught them to yield to the supremacy of the Roman people, so that those districts and those nations which were previously not known to us, neither by anyone's letters, nor by the personal account of anyone, nor even by vague report, have now been overrun by our own general, by our own army, and by the arms of the Roman people. So, note there, Cicero is basically giving his approval not only to a war of defense, but a war of offense on preemptive grounds. And that's pretty striking. So finishing up, just a brief quote here from the rest of Cicero's speech. Previously, O conscript fathers, O senators, we have only known the road into Gaul. All other parts of it were possessed by nations which were either hostile to this empire or treacherous or unknown to us, or, at all events, savage, barbarian, and warlike. No one ever existed who did not wish these nations to be crushed and subdued, nor has anyone from the very first rise of this empire ever carefully deliberated about our republic without thinking that Gaul was the chief source of danger to this empire. But still, on account of the power and the vast populations of those nations, we never before have waged war against all of them. We have always been content to resist them when attacked. Now, at last, it has been achieved that there should be one and the same boundary to our own empire and to those nations. End quote. And, Cicero goes on to reason that even though Gaul is mostly pacified, and let's not forget he's got his own personal disagreements with Caesar, it's in the interests of the Republic to let the same man who brought the war also bring permanent peace and stability to the region. So after that speech, the Senate votes to, leave Caesar's provinces untouched. They're not going to replace him. And they also vote, meanwhile, this is again at Cicero's instigation, kind of remarkably, and against some very determined opposition from the hardliner conservatives like Cato and Domitius, they vote not just to give Caesar that 15-day Thanksgiving celebration, but also to supply his war effort through the state treasury, which is a big win for Caesar, and he doesn't really need the money. I mean, he's bringing in a lot of riches from these pretty well-off cities of Gaul, and they also vote to send him additional legates to help. So all this is to say that Caesar, in the midst of his brilliant successes in Gaul, also wins an amazing victory on the home front. I think you can see why he was so impressive to his contemporaries there. And with that wrapped up, Caesar heads for the Atlantic coast to take on the Veneti. He gets there, of course, quicker than they had expected him. Quote, "The Veneti and likewise the rest of the states were informed of Caesar's coming, and at the same time they perceived the magnitude of their offense. They had detained and cast into prison deputies, that is, ambassadors, men whose title had ever been sacred and inviolable among all nations. Therefore, as the danger was great, they began to prepare for war on a corresponding scale." End quote. So he pauses there to remind you that this is a just war, and the Veneti's offense was egregious. That's important. And next up, he's going to tell you why this is going to be a particularly hard victory for him to pull off. Quote, "And especially the Veneti took measures to provide naval equipment, and they were filled with all the more hope because they relied so much on the nature of the country. They knew that on the land all roads were intersected by estuaries, that our navigation was hampered by ignorance of the locality and by the scarcity of harbors, and they trusted that the Roman armies would be unable to remain long in their neighborhood by reason of the lack of grain. And this is the key part here coming up. Moreover, they felt that even though everything should turn out contrary to expectation, they were predominant in sea power, while the Romans had no supply of ships, no knowledge of the shoals, harbors, or islands in the region where they were about to wage war. And they could see that navigation on a landlocked sea was quite different from navigation on an ocean, very vast and open. Therefore, having adopted this plan, they fortified their towns, gathered grain from the fields, and assembled as many ships as possible in Venetia, where it was known that Caesar would begin the campaign. End quote. So this is kind of a classic Roman challenge. The Veneti are thinking, these Romans may know how to fight on land, they may know how to sail on the Mediterranean, where, you can lose some ships in a storm at sea, but it's nothing like the furious Atlantic. Have you seen videos of some of the waves that you can get on the Atlantic coast of Portugal or the Basque country of France? The Atlantic storms can kick up waves 50, 60, 90 feet high in the right conditions. There's just no comparison. But who else was it that underestimated Roman maritime capabilities? Yes, the Carthaginians in the First Punic Wars. But there, Caesar's given you some of the reasons why this nation of the Veneti are feeling pretty good about their chances in the war. Plus, they've got this long list of allies that Caesar gives. I won't read them all, but it includes the Nomenetes, the people of Nantes, and very notably, another breadcrumb presaging something else Caesar has in mind. He says, the Veneti send to that mysterious isle of Britain for some auxiliaries. Now, we'll hear more about the rather formidable military defenses of the Veneti in just a minute. But Caesar first gives you his perspective, what he's thinking about the upcoming conflict. Quote, the difficulties of the campaign were such as we have shown above, but nevertheless many considerations moved Caesar to undertake it. Such were the outrageous detention of Roman knights, the renewal of war after surrender. Remember, they had concluded this treaty with young Publius Crassus. The revolt after hostages given, the conspiracy of so many states, and above all the fear that if this district were not dealt with, other nations might suppose they had the same liberty. He knew well that almost all the Gauls were bent on revolution and could be recklessly and rapidly aroused to war. He knew also that all men are naturally bent on liberty and hate the state of slavery. Again, there, I think, you can see he's very honest about his opponent's moral seriousness. Finishing up here. And therefore he deemed it proper to divide his army and disperse it at wider intervals before more states could join the conspiracy. End quote. And so Caesar sends off Labienus to the east. He sends young Publius Crassus to the south, to Aquitaine. And he sends Sabinus north toward Normandy. More on how the last two fared later on. And noteworthy here also, he puts young Decimus Brutus in charge of the fleet against the Veneti. And Brutus has also got some Gallic allies building ships for them, and he commands those as well. And Decimus Brutus here is not the more famous Brutus, though Decimus is also a character in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. But all the same, Decimus ends up being, once again, one of these conspirators who were on the side of Caesar but eventually turned on him and assassinated him. And then he ends up playing this important role in the civil war with Antony and Octavian that followed. I think that this is his first appearance in history, actually. But, all that stuff is much later. It's noteworthy here, by the way, that he calls Decimus, as well as Publius Crassus, he calls them young. That is to designate that these are promising men who are not yet 30 years old, and they haven't even held the requisite office of quaestor, and so they haven't joined the Senate. But they're being entrusted with these great duties, presumably because they're worthy of them. So once again, I think that just underlines Caesar's got an amazing talent pool going on. So I want you to listen now to how Caesar describes the territory of the Veneti and their allies. And he's, again, doing some great storytelling here, setting up the whole struggle first by describing all of the challenges such that you come off wondering, oh, how is this going to be possible? That's good storytelling. So here's what I mean about what Caesar's about to say. So basically the Veneti are a sea people, and for their strength, they rely on these heavily fortified coastal cities, which Caesar describes here. Quote, "The positions of the strongholds of the Veneti, etc., were generally of one kind. They were set at the ends of spits of land and promontories, so as to allow no approach on foot when the tide had rushed in from the sea, which regularly happens every 12 hours, nor in ships, because when the tide ebbed again, the ships would be damaged in the shoal water." So think, if you've ever seen pictures of Mont Saint-Michel in France, it's this fortress that's sometimes an island, sometimes accessible by the beach, depending on the tide. This is close to that area. The Atlantic tides in France are famous. They can vary by as much as 49 feet of sea level. Going on with Caesar here. Both circumstances, therefore, hindered the assault of the strongholds. And whenever the natives were in fact overcome by huge siege works, that is to say, when the sea had been set back by massive moles built up to level the town walls, so he's building these kind of piers into the tidal plain. And so whenever they began to despair of their fortunes, they would simply bring close inshore a large number of ships, of which they possessed an unlimited supply, and take off all their stuff and retire to the nearest strongholds, there to defend themselves again with the same advantages of position. End quote. So these people are going to be very hard to take either by land or by sea. And Caesar adds to the difficulties that they face from the terrain, the difficulty also that they face in the difference in ship technology. Quote, "They pursue these tactics for a great part of the summer, the more easily because our own ships were detained by foul weather, and because the difficulty of navigation on a vast and open sea with strong tides and few, nay, scarcely any, harbors was extreme. Not so the ships of the Gauls, for they were built and equipped in the following fashion." Here comes the naval technology piece. "Their keels were considerably more flat than those of our own, that they might more easily weather shoals and ebb tide. Their prows were very lofty, and their sterns were similarly adapted to meet the force of waves and storms. The ships were made entirely of oak to endure any violence and buffeting." I believe that Mediterranean ships are more typically made of softer woods like pine, which works in the Mediterranean. So more here on the Veneti ships. "The cross pieces were beams, a foot thick, fastened with iron nails as thick as a thumb. The anchors were attached by iron chains instead of rope cables. Skins and pieces of leather, finely finished, were used instead of sails, either because the natives had no supply of flax and no knowledge of its use, or more probably because they thought that the mighty ocean storms and hurricanes could not be ridden out, nor the mighty burden of their ships conveniently controlled by means of sails." And here he compares the Roman ships. "When our own fleet encountered these ships, it proved its superiority only in speed and oarsmanship. In all other respects, having regard to the locality and the force of the tempests, the others were more suitable and adaptable. For our ships could not damage them with rams. They were so stoutly built." That's a major tactic for ancient sea battles, ramming them with the prow of your ship. "Nor by reason of their height was it easy to hurl a pike, and for the same reason they were less readily gripped by grapnels. Moreover, when the wind began to rage and they ran before it, they endured the storm more easily, and rested in shoals more safely, with no fear of rocks or crags if left by the tide, whereas our own vessels could not but dread the possibility of all these chances." So, Roman ships cannot handle these Atlantic storms. And also, if the tide goes out, as it does, every 12 hours, the Veneti just sit there on the beach in these flat-bottom ships, and they can just wait it out. these tall sort of mini fortresses, and they'll be sailing again in 12 hours or so. Roman ships, on the other hand, they're going to get damaged, they're going to roll over, they have to be very careful to follow the tide out. So going on with the campaign here, almost to prove the point of how hard this is, Caesar tells how, he himself gets busy taking them on by land. He starts capturing the odd fortress here or there, but it's kind of pointless because the Veneti will just escape and regroup to another fortress. They've got lots of them. So Caesar decides to wait for Decimus Brutus and the fleet, which is assembling nearby. But when the fleet arrives, as it soon does, it's still not clear how the Romans are supposed to make any progress against these expert mariner Veneti. And Caesar explains, quote, "For our commanders knew the enemy could not be damaged by the ram, while even when turrets were set up on board, the lofty sterns of the native ships commanded even these, so that from the lower level missiles could not be hurled properly, while those discharged by the Gauls gained a heavier impact." So the Romans build these towers on their ships. There's a relief that depicts this happening in the Battle of Actium, and it's just not working. The towers that they can build are just not high enough. But they eventually come up with a new kind of strategy, and they wait for a day when the weather is good, and they engage in a battle. And here's what they do. Quote, "One device our men had prepared to great advantage, sharp-pointed hooks inserted and fastened to long poles, in shape not unlike siege hooks." Pausing here, so usually they're trying to grapnel the ships with grapnels on the end of ropes, but here they have them stuck to these long poles. Going on. "When by these contrivances the halyards, which fastened the yards to the masts, were caught and drawn taut, the ship," the Roman ship that is, "was rowed hard ahead, and they were snapped short." And the yards on the ships, these are these horizontal wood sail holder things. See how you're learning from an expert in nautical terminology here. So what the Romans are doing, it's sort of like hooking a cable attached to your pickup truck and hooking it to a stop sign and then driving away. That's what they're doing with the Veneti's sails. And here's what happens. With the halyards cut, those are the ropes on the sail, the yards of necessity fell down, and as all the hope of the Gallic ships lay in their sails and tackle, when those were torn away, all chance of using their ships was taken away also. And, again, the Romans are not so great with the sailing stuff, but they're really strong rowers, and the Veneti are exactly the opposite. Therefore, the rest of the conflict was a question of courage, in which our own troops easily had the advantage. The more so because, and this is very important here, the engagement took place in sight of Caesar and of the whole army, so that no exploit a little more gallant than the rest could escape notice. The army, in fact, was occupying all the hills and higher ground from which there was a near view down upon the sea. End quote. So, you've got Caesar and his officers standing there on the shoreline like spectators, and I think he's got such a great eye for the psychology of his sailors there. The big man is watching. And it's worth thinking about there, the gaze of the general. If your operation ever becomes so big that your guys aren't, periodically at least, subjected to the power of your gaze as the leader, so to speak, well, you should probably change something. Because it's not just about having someone, say management, looking at them. It's about having the general himself doing it for that full psychological impact. Going on here, quote, "When the yards had been torn down as described, and each ship of the Veneti was surrounded by 2 or 3 of our own, the troops strove with the utmost force to climb onto the enemy's ships." So the Romans with their smaller ships, they're piling on these Venetian ships like hyenas on a lion. "And when several of them had been boarded, the other natives saw what was coming, and as they could think of no device to meet it, they hastened to seek safety in flight. And they had headed all their vessels down the wind, when suddenly a calm so complete and absolute came on that they could not stir from the spot. This circumstance was in the highest degree fortunate for the settlement of the business, for our troops pursued and boarded the vessels one by one, with the result that of all the number, very few, when the night came on, reached the land. The battle indeed lasted from about the 4th hour to sunset, so from about 10 a.m. to sunset. End quote. So, where did the Veneti go wrong? Well, they studied their enemies, but they paid more attention to the Romans' unique weakness rather than their unique strengths. Rowing, war technology in general, these hooked things. And of course, most importantly, and most Roman of all, methodical, brute determination. And here's the result. Quote, "This engagement finished the campaign against the Veneti and the whole seacoast. For on the one hand, all the fighting men, nay, all the older men who had any sagacity or distinction, had assembled there." So the Veneti have all their talent fighting this war. On the other, they had collected in one place every single ship they had anywhere. And after such losses, the rest of their men had no point to retire to, no means of defending the towns. Accordingly, they surrendered themselves and all they had to Caesar. End quote. So they surrendered. Caesar decides, however, that their punishment should be particularly severe, so that in the future the Gauls should take more consideration of respecting what the Romans would consider international law, that is, the interstate customs protecting envoys and ambassadors. And so he has all the town councilors, the leadership, the decision-makers executed, and he sells the rest of the people into slavery. You'll be pleased to hear today that this region does now have a lively Breton-speaking community. That's the language descended from the old Celtic days. But that doesn't make up for the fact that Caesar's treatment was, even in his own day, probably seen as uncommonly harsh. Napoleon, in fact, criticizes him for it. And here's what Napoleon says in his commentaries about this incident. "One can only despise Caesar's treatment of the Senate of Vannes. This people had not revolted. They had only provided hostages and promised to live quietly, but they were in possession of all their rights and liberties. They had indeed given Caesar grounds to make war against them, but not to violate the laws of nations in their case and to misuse his victory in so atrocious a way. This conduct was not just, still less was it politique. Such means never achieve their aim. They anger and disgust the nations. The punishment of a few chief people is all that justice and policy permit. It is an important rule to treat prisoners well. The English broke this moral and political rule by placing French prisoners on hulks, which has made them hated throughout the continent." End quote. Napoleon obviously speaking there from his own experience and sort of with a message to people of his day. But I'll let you decide for yourself whether you think Caesar's actions were justified or prudent. It's worth noting here that we do find a few Veneti and other tribes from this region joining other revolts later in the story. And probably not an insignificant number of these people that he sold off were not condemned to a life of servitude, but ransomed by friends or kinsmen. The point is that they were sold, and Caesar, importantly, got the money for it. Did he need the money? Especially after capturing the very rich cities of these men of the coast. They were rich through their trade with Britain. Well, he might have realized how close he came to getting undermined at home by his enemies in this year in the political arena, and he might have been wanting to build up a big war chest for the war on the home front. That is, war waged with bribes and favors to coerce his opposition. Who knows? But anyway, that's the one main accomplishment of Caesar himself in this year of campaigning. And considering his victories on the political front, I think that alone is pretty impressive. But he does close the book with two, we could call them case studies, which highlight the fact that he's got some talented men working under him who are capable of independent initiative. And they're worth treating briefly here because Caesar is also including them for the leadership lessons that they contain, so let's hit them. First up is Quintus Titurius Sabinus, and that's the guy that he sent north to Normandy. Now, Sabinus does end up making a fatal, tragic mistake in a later book that we'll get to soon. But the fact that he performs so competently here in this book shows just how hard won Caesar's ultimate victory over Gaul was. That, men like this, who were successful often, could also end up getting defeated disastrously later by these very crafty Gauls. So what is Sabinus doing here? So he's camped near modern Cherbourg, which is on the tip of the Normandy Peninsula, northwest France. And this is all happening actually before the defeat of the Veneti at sea has happened, or at least before the news has reached them. And the locals are rising up in rebellion to join the Veneti. And I think that underlines that this was a really substantial, serious threat to the Romans, this uprising of the Veneti. And some of the locals even murdered those of their town councilors who opposed joining the rebellion. They're like, no, we want to go to war. And these locals, I think they're called the Venelli, they're gathered under the head of a commander named Viridovix, and they raise an army and they approach Sabinus's camp near Cherbourg. They're about 2 miles away from the Romans. And these guys start marching out their troops in battle formation every day to try to challenge the Romans to a fight. Sabinus, however, he's following the classic Roman strategy, of course. He's fortified his camp on high ground, and he's also got a long slope in front of the camp. It's about 1 mile long. So after a few days of the Venelli and the other Gauls coming out and, offering battle, Sabinus's men start to say, hey, come on, we can take him. Lead us out. But Sabinus refuses. And the enemy starts to get bolder, and they march all the way up to the walls of the camp, and they start throwing insults at him. I think you got to imagine, they're thumbing their noses, pulling their pants down. And this goes on long enough that the Roman soldiers themselves, they start to accuse Sabinus of cowardice behind his back. And Sabinus, of course, hears about this, but he stays cool. And Caesar describes what happens next. And it makes you think this was all part of Sabinus's plan. Quote, when this impression of timidity had been confirmed, Sabinus chose out a fit man of cunning, one of the Gauls whom he had with him as auxiliaries. Of course, the auxiliaries are among the nobles of the Gauls, so probably a pretty savvy, smart Gaul. And he induced him by great rewards and promises to go over to the enemy, and he instructed him in what he would have him do. When the pretended deserter had reached the enemy, he set before them the timidity of the Romans, explained to them how Caesar himself was in dire straits and hard pressed by the Veneti, then told them that no later than the next night, Sabinus intended to lead his army secretly out of his camp and to set out and go to the assistance of Caesar. And here's how the Venelli, these locals, react. Upon hearing this, they all cried with one consent that the chance of successful achievement should not be lost, that they should march upon the camp. Many considerations encouraged the Gauls to this course. The hesitation of Sabinus during the previous days, the confirmation given by the deserter, the lack of victuals, for which they had made too careless a provision, the hope inspired by the Venetian war, and the general readiness of men to believe what they wish. With these thoughts to spur them on, they would not allow their leader Viridovix and the rest of the leaders to leave the council until they had their permission to take up arms and press on to the camp. Rejoicing then at the permission once it was given, as though at a victory assured, they collected faggots and brushwood to fill up the trenches of the Romans and marched on the camp. End quote. So Sabinus here began with a modest advantage, right? He's got the high ground. He's got probably superior soldiers, battle-hardened Roman veterans. But partly due to the extreme asymmetric advantage that the Romans have in logistics in general, this is something that we should keep in mind, he's got all the provisions that he needs, really. The Romans are, super expert logistics guys. And, the Gauls just typically don't have that kind of infrastructure worked out to supply a standing army for a long time in a single place with all these hungry men and horses and pack animals. Time is almost always on the Roman side in this war. And so Sabinus, he waits to turn his modest advantage into a major advantage and to trick the Gauls into committing to a battle on very unfavorable terms. And that was especially the fact that, as Caesar mentions, to reach the Roman camp, the Gauls have to hike a mile uphill. And that's exactly what they do. So, day for battle comes, maybe that same day. They charge up the hill at a dead run, thinking that this will give them the element of suddenness and surprise. But once they get to the top, they're pretty exhausted because, remember this, they're also carrying bundles of sticks and logs and bushes to fill up the Roman trenches so they can assail the walls. That is exactly when Sabinus strikes. He sallies out of 2 gates at once and falls upon these wheezing, burdened Gauls with determined, enthusiastic, well-rested top Roman infantry. And you can guess what happens next. Quote, "The order was executed with the advantage of ground. The enemy were inexperienced and fatigued, the Romans courageous and schooled by previous engagements. The result was that without standing even one of our attacks, the Gauls immediately turned and ran. Hampered as they were, our troops pursued them with strength unimpaired and slew a great number of them. The rest of our cavalry chased and caught and left but a few who had got away from the rout. And so it chanced that in the same hour Sabinus learnt of the naval battle and Caesar of Sabinus's victory, and all the states at once surrendered to Sabinus. For while the temper of the Gauls is eager and ready to undertake a campaign, their purpose is feeble and in no way steadfast to endure disasters." End quote. So I think if you take one lesson from this whole episode, or maybe this whole series, do everything you can to fight your enemies on your terms, on ground and condition that favors you. Think of the Roman logistical system backing Sabinus up. Think of his selection of his site. Think of his choice to wait, to trick his enemy into committing on unfavorable terms. You can be devastating that way, even with inferior numbers. All right. The final case study is young Publius Crassus, son of Caesar's patron, Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Young Crassus is headed for Aquitania, which is the southwest of France. Remember, Caesar sent him there at the outset of the war with the Veneti with the ostensible mission of preventing the Aquitanians from sending any aid to the Veneti. So it's another sort of preemptive strike, and it kind of makes sense given that the Aquitanians are a Gallic people who live just further down along the coast. So Crassus does his duty. He goes to Aquitania. He crosses the Garonne River, which is the border between Aquitania and the rest of Gaul. And once he does, he's immediately attacked by a powerful nation called the Sotiates. And after a fierce battle, he ends up defeating them, and he chases them, and he ends up holding them up in one of the strongholds that they've retreated to. And at this point, he lays out siege sheds, these vines that we've talked about in earlier episodes, and he starts building his siege towers. And Caesar here points out that the Aquitanians put up a very strong fight here against the siege works because these guys are world experts in the art of tunneling underground. There are a lot of copper mines in this region, so they do this all the time. But Crassus and the Romans managed to fight them off. They collapsed tunnels, I don't know, whatever it took. He doesn't specify. And so the Sotiates, they finally surrender, so it would seem. But then this happens. It's never over till it's over with the Gauls. Quote, "Their request was granted, and they proceeded to deliver up their arms as ordered. Then, while the attention of all our troops was engaged upon that business, Adiatunus, the commander-in-chief of the Sotiates, took action from another quarter of the town with 600 devotees, whom they call soldurii." And this is very interesting. "The rule of these men is that in life they enjoy all the benefits with the comrades to whose friendship they have committed themselves, while if any violent fate befalls their fellows, they either endure the same misfortune along with them or take their own lives. And no one yet in memory of man has been found to refuse death after the slaughter of the comrade to whose friendship he had devoted himself. We met with an institution like this in Spain, already, way back in the life of Sertorius, the greatest Roman rebel, when Sertorius actually had his own group of these soldurii guys, totally devoted to the death to their commander. Well, with these men going on here, Adiatunnus tried to make a sortie, but a shout was raised on that side of the entrenchment. The troops ran to arms, and a sharp engagement was fought there. Adiatunnus was driven back into the town, but for all that, he begged and obtained from Crassus the same terms of surrender as at first. End quote. So Crassus is remarkably merciful in the end there. But it's not over, and there are other nations of Aquitania rising up to crush the Romans. Again, Crassus is very close to Spain, and here's what he's up against. Quote, "At this juncture, the natives, alarmed by the information that a town fortified alike by natural position and by the hand of man had been carried within a few days of his arrival, began to send deputies about in every direction to conspire together, to deliver hostages to each other, and to make ready a force. They even sent deputies to those states of nearer Spain, which border on Aquitania, inviting help and leaders from thence. Upon their arrival, they attempted the campaign with great prestige and a great host of men. And as their leaders for the same, they selected men who had served for the whole period with Quintus Sertorius, and were believed to be past masters of war. These leaders, in Roman fashion, set to work to take up positions, to entrench a camp, and to cut off our supplies." End quote. Sertorius, you will remember if you've listened to his life, was one of the toughest foes the Romans faced in this century. He was known for training his men particularly well. So these guys are using a solid Roman strategy against the Romans, and they end up walling themselves off in a fort with very good supplies. They're sending out to the countryside to cut off the Roman supply chains to get time on their side, so they're kind of trying to turn the tables there. So Crassus judges that he's got to act quickly, force a battle. But Caesar takes the time to point out, Crassus also called a meeting of his war council to put the question before them, like a good lad, consulting the wise elders, and what do you know, they agree with him. Do a battle. Do it. And let's just say, long story short, Crassus attacks this Aquitanian fort, and he does it by a frontal assault, and it's a hard slog, but then he has his cavalry ride way around unseen to the back. Then they scope out a weakly defended point behind the defenders, and they manage to take the camp from behind. And before the defenders know what's happening, their streets are flooded with Roman auxiliary cavalry, and the infantry at the front of the fort, they hear this, and they get their energies renewed, and they overwhelm the city. And with that, Aquitania is pacified. Great work, young Crassus. Now, that episode of its own, with young Crassus, is an inspiring case study, I think, for young leaders entrusted with a difficult, independent mission. But I think one of the big reasons that Caesar included it and gave Crassus so much airtime in these commentaries is because of this bigger chess game that Caesar is playing with the power politics situation in Rome. See, after his campaign, Publius Crassus, after winning in Aquitania, he heads home to Rome, leading a couple of legions of Caesar's fighting men. Precisely, this had to be the plan all along, precisely so that they can vote in the consular elections for the consuls of the year 55. And this was part of the deal that Caesar struck with the other triumvirs, with Crassus and Pompey, at the Conference of Luca that we mentioned earlier in this episode. And the plan is for Pompey and Crassus to get elected consuls. And this, of course, is in the days before mail-in ballots. So, the soldiers have to be there in person. And Caesar wants to send Crassus home with as much glory and honor as possible, to make all that very easy for him to do, and maybe to catch some goodwill from Publius's father, Marcus, who's going to be very important in securing Caesar's interests in Rome in the coming years. And, spoiler alert, Pompey and Crassus do get elected consuls for 55. So Caesar here, he's using his power as a writer and his position as a general to shore up his status as a politician by supporting his friends back home. If all that's not 4D chess, I don't know what is. And I think it shows how masterful Caesar was at playing these multiple games at once. And just a note here, Caesar, you might recall from the life of Crassus, also lent some of his auxiliary Gallic cavalry to join the Crassuses, father and son, on their grand, ill-fated mission to Mesopotamia. And let's not invite bad omens by recounting that story here. But just imagine for a moment these Gauls going from fighting arguably their own countrymen and, lands that are recognizable to them in Aquitania, riding all the way to the desert steppes of northern Iraq. Incredible. Napoleon, to close here, makes an interesting comment reflecting on the successes of Caesar and young Crassus and also Sabinus in this book. And here's what he says, quote, "Brittany, that large and difficult province, submitted without making efforts in proportion to its strength. The same applies to Aquitaine and Lower Normandy." I think that's very interesting. They didn't supply efforts in proportion to their strength. And Caesar does remind us in this book, by the way, that Aquitania comprised pretty much a third of the entirety of Gaul. So Napoleon has a pretty good point here. Crassus only had a little more than 1 legion of troops, maybe 6,000, 6,500 infantry. He also had a pretty strong cavalry attachment too. But here's the point that Napoleon wants to draw out by pointing out this apparently lackluster performance from the Gauls of these various regions. This is Napoleon here again, this is due to causes which cannot be precisely determined, but it is easy to see that the main reason lay in the spirit of isolation and local loyalty which characterized the peoples of Gaul. At this time, they had no national or even regional spirit. Their loyalty was at the level of the town. This is the same spirit which has since forged the fetters of Italy. He's speaking there before Italian unification, which happened later in the 19th century. "Nothing is more opposed to a national spirit," Napoleon says, "to general ideas of liberty, than the private spirit of family or village. Because of this fragmentation, it also followed that the Gauls had no trained standing army, therefore no knowledge of military science. If Caesar's glory depended solely on his conquest of Gaul, it would be in doubt. Any nation which lost sight of the importance of a standing army, ever ready for action, and which relied on mass levies or militias, would suffer the same fate as Gaul." End quote. And, of course, we've only just begun to get a glimpse of the deeds that built Caesar his glory, and Napoleon thought he deserved his reputation, but just not for conquering Gaul all alone. And on this point, I think, you wonder if Napoleon might actually have the early United States in mind. You see the wisdom here of a guy like Alexander Hamilton, who Napoleon was aware of. Hamilton, of course, another avid reader of Caesar's commentaries and Plutarch's Lives. And Hamilton insisted that the newly founded nation of the United States have a strong standing army, rather than these disparate local independent militias, which a lot of the decentralization-favoring Republicans like Jefferson preferred. Hamilton, of course, a man that Talleyrand considered even greater and more brilliant than Napoleon. Talleyrand knew both of them personally. Well, think about that. Meanwhile, to close the book, Caesar goes off to northeast Gaul to give another couple of small, rowdy tribes the Caesar treatment for rebels, and he chops down huge swaths of their forest, and then they scurry away after only a paragraph or two. And with that, the campaigns of the year 56 are over. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this, leave us a good review, tell a friend, Or, better yet, try to learn these deeds of Caesar inside and out and share the lessons you draw from them with a friend you think might need some advice or encouragement. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.